But it's a really interesting phenomenon now because I feel like we're heading into a potential phase where people have to start thinking about money. It's certainly starting to see this in the UK now, in that whilst we've had quoted, say, 10% inflation, what you're starting to see people share on Twitter or on Facebook is photos of their shopping. And they're saying, here's my shopping basket for the week. I spent £60, and you're really seeing maybe a meal, maybe 2 meals and a breakfast worth. And you're looking and thinking, a couple of years ago, you could buy a week of shopping for that. And so I've noticed that people are starting to get squeezed. And I was watching your talk this morning. I wrote some notes. I put it on my phone. I'm going to go back to here because there's something that really stood out to me. I tried to explain to Danny I did a really bad job. But you talked about the narrow corridor of liberty.
Yeah.
Can you explain that in a better way than I tried to Danny? And then I'm going to tell you what I've been thinking with regards to this.
Yeah, of course. So this is a theory put forward by two political scientists, James Robinson and Daron Acemoglu, to describe what happens when the state and society are in a race for technological supremacy. So, the state makes some moves, and then society makes some moves, and there's this competition that actually improves both state and society over time if the power is balanced. It creates this narrow corridor in which liberty can flourish, because in their theory, liberty is actually a product of the rule of law, but the rule of law that does not function as tyranny. And so, when does law become tyranny? I mean, there's no absolute bright line, but as the corridor collapses, that's when we see tyranny emerge.
Right. So what I wrote next to that was CBDCs versus Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. Would you argue, therefore, that race is the narrow corridor of liberty in relation to money?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And so we're in a race of Bitcoin versus CBDCs right now.
That's right.
That's scary stuff.
Yeah.
And Danny brought up the point that a lot of people have been saying on stage this week that FedNow is a CBDC. Is it?
It doesn't meet the kind of strict definition of a CBDC, but it increases their surveillance capabilities on transactions. So there's certainly CBDC-like aspects. There's certainly, if there's a spectrum there, it's another step closer to CBDC, but it's different than a full-blown CBDC.
Yeah. So, sorry to jump in there, but I think this is a really important question. So, this is one of the things I was getting at in my talk on anthropology of money. There is a difference between payment and settlement. These are two different social processes. And so, what FedNow is it is a network for real-time settlement. It is not a method of payment, which is what money is, or what a CBDC is. So ostensibly, if you had a CBDC, then the method of payment technically would be so merged with the ledger for settlement that it's hard to distinguish the two. But in fact, they are two different technologies.
So is it a layer 1 CBDC?
Well, so a CBDC doesn't actually have to have any particular technical architecture.
Okay.
In the early days, they were trying to do a blockchain CBDC. I think, I don't know of, which countries today are still committed to blockchain versus other types of ledgers. But I think they all figured out we don't actually need a blockchain to do a CBDC because it's just a shared ledger.
Yeah.
It's just a database that we all, control and update.
Matthew Mazinski, who I think he's doing a CBDC tracker for Human Rights Foundation, pushes back quite strongly against the fact that FedNow is a CBDC. Mm-hmm. And I know that I think a lot of people kind of jump to the conclusion that this is additional control, and obviously that's something to push back against, which I completely understand. But I'm just interested. I think he explains it like a very similar payment system to what we have in the UK with FasterPay. Mm-hmm. Are they architecturally the same?
I don't know if they're architecturally the same because I haven't studied both architectures technically, but in effect, FedNow is trying to catch up. I mean, they've stated this outright with what many other countries already have. Whether it's South Korea or others, they have real-time central bank settlement.
We spoke a long time ago. maybe a year ago when we covered the refounding I always pronounce this was it the refounding of the American dream?
Yes.
I was going to say refinding of the American dream.
Oh, yeah. Both.
And one of the things that we've been talking about regularly is that I feel like I'm really struggling to explain this oncoming storm to my friends and my family. We did a show this morning with James Lavish and Preston Bish, which you would have loved, Lyn, because we were covering the debt clock. We were covering the issues within the bond markets, the potential of, the next decade of inflation, which you and I have talked about, whether it's going to be a slow creep or they're going to come in with high inflation. But I can't communicate these things to my friends. But you can see the future. You can look at the various technologies that governments are bringing in to bring more control over the people. We can see this this control over money. We can see the impact it's having on people. Yet we are like a frog being boiled slowly. And I'm starting to wonder if, when you talked about the refounding of the American dream, it's almost like we need a rethink of governance in a world which is digital, because it feels far too easy for government to take too much control in a digital world.
Right. Absolutely. No, I mean, the fundamental innovation of the Enlightenment era political revolutions was separation of powers. Was, how do you prevent power from just metastasizing? Well, you separate it out and you give different branches of government different functions, and then allow them to check each other's power, and that will keep it in check. What we found is there was some validity to that worked for a time, but over time there ended up being this narrowing sort of revolving door between different branches of government. Government and industry. And so the power of the state has, in effect, been a shared point of interest among all branches of government. And so I would suggest that the system of checks and balances has broken down in the United States.
When you say it's broken down, like, what are the key signals for that breaking down for you?
So things like increasingly legislating through federal agencies, which are the executive branch, instead of through Congress. So, the federal government currently has, we don't know how many federal agencies because there's no actual shared definition of what it is. But each agency has the mandate to create policy in its sort of area of remit. These are organizations not accountable to Congress for the most part, not accountable to the American people. Often they function completely in secrecy. They're political appointees. And so, in effect, you have law now routinely being made through the executive branch and judicial collusion with that in the process of judicial review. So, whether it's, the 1954 legislation, this is actually an example of congressional legislation, but 1954 legislation that suspended, in effect, the Fourth Amendment 100 miles within the U.S. border, that was upheld. Qualified immunity has been repeatedly upheld. The independence of federal agencies from suit by U.S. citizens has been upheld. And so we have a Byzantine bureaucratic system that, in effect, has created this unaccountable form of executive power, and that is the consolidating state.
So is the state winning the race at the moment?
I would say yes, it is.
And how much would you point to money being as a driving factor behind this?
Well, money is just one mechanism of control, but it's an important one. It's an information technology. So the money is a social institution whose purpose is to facilitate exchange. Well, exchange is another word for communication. The government always has a vested interest in who communicates with whom about what and for what purpose. Until recently, it's not been possible to exercise a certain level of granular control over financial communication between people, but now it is.
And with the CBDC, that would get considerably worse.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the transaction itself, but transacting is also now intrinsically tied with verifiable identity, and so it's in effect the end of privacy as we know it.